The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast, empty sky in brutal shades of crimson and bruised purple. Below it, the prairie stretched into an eternity of dun-colored grass and baked earth, broken only by a single dirt track that snaked toward nowhere. Upon that track, a woman walked, her feet, bare and blistered, left faint. Pained impressions in the dust, a black dress, the color of perpetual mourning, hung from her thin frame, its hem torn and stiff with the grime of a long and desperate journey. She was Sarah, though the name felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had a home, a husband, a life. That woman had vanished in the smoke and roar of a midnight fire, leaving this hollowed-out creature in her place. The gossip that had simmered in the town of Redemption for months had finally boiled over, scalding her, branding her. They said she was a curse on her husband, Jedediah, that her barrenness was a sign of God's displeasure. When Jedediah was found at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken and his pockets empty, the whispers turned to accusations. When the farm, already choked by debt to the town's most powerful man, went up in flames a week later, those accusations became certainty in the court of public opinion. She had not even been allowed to bury him. The church folk, led by the banker's wife, had turned their backs. So she had walked. She did not know for how long. Days had blurred into a haze of shimmering heat and nights into a cold, star-pricked terror. In one hand, she clutched the only two things she had pulled from the inferno. The first was a small, silver locket, warm from the constant pressure of her palm. It did not hold a portrait of Jedediah. It held the fading, stoic faces of her mother and father, taken years ago by a traveling photographer. They were the last people who had looked at her with uncomplicated love, and she clung to their memory as a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The other was a single sheet of paper, folded into a tight, neat square. It was a letter from her sister back east, received a year ago, begging her to leave Jedediah in his sour moods, to come home where she was wanted. A letter she had been too afraid, too dutiful, to answer. Now, it was a testament to every wrong choice she had ever made. The thirst was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws scraping at her throat. Ahead, a thin line of green, darker than the surrounding prairie, promised a creek, cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the faint evening breeze, huddled along its banks. Hope, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful, flickered in her chest. She stumbled toward it, her legs shaking with an exhaustion that went bone deep. The world tilted, the blood-red sky spinning into a vortex. Her knees buckled. She landed hard in the dust just yards from the water. The impact jolted a sound from her, a dry, ragged gasp. She tried to crawl, her fingers digging uselessly into the packed earth. The effort was too much. Her body, finally surrendering, went limp. The locket and the letter slipped from her grasp. She laid her cheek against the cooling ground, the grit pressing into her skin. A single word escaped her chapped lips, a sound swallowed by the immense silence of the land. Lost. The world dissolved into a merciful darkness. Luke McAllister saw her from the ridge. He had been checking the northern line of his small ranch, making sure no stray cattle had wandered off. When the splash of black against the pale dirt caught his eye, he reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, and watched for a long moment. His hand rested instinctively on the stock of the Winchester rifle sheathed beside his saddle. The frontier had taught him caution in hard, bloody lessons. A lone woman on a road this far from any town was an anomaly, and anomalies were often trouble. She could be a decoy for road agents hiding in the brush. She could be a runaway, a whore cast out from some saloon, or the widow of an outlaw with a posse not far behind. None of those things were his concern. He was a man who had made a covenant with solitude. The small cabin nestled in the foothills, the 100 head of cattle, the vast, empty land. This was his world, and he guarded its perimeter fiercely, yet he did not turn his horse and ride away. He watched as she collapsed, a slow, boneless folding, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. It was the stillness that followed that decided him. It was the stillness of utter defeat, not of cunning. With a low sigh that stirred the dust on his worn leather vest, he nudged Dust Devil forward. He dismounted a few feet from her, his movements economical and quiet. He was a broad-shouldered man, built of the same tough, unyielding material as the land itself. His face was a map of his years, lines etched around his eyes by a relentless sun. A faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in the scene with a practiced economy. The bare, bloodied feet, the torn dress, the way her hand lay open and empty near a silver locket. She was young, younger than he had first thought. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had escaped its pins and lay in tangled disarray around her face, matted with dirt. Luke knelt, his knee cracking in the silence. He gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am?" There was no response. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter in her chest. He saw the cracked lips, the pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. She was not faking. She was running on nothing. He uncorked his canteen and, lifting her head with a careful hand, dribbled a small amount of water onto her lips. Her eyelids flickered. She coughed, a dry, rasping sound. Her eyes, when they opened, were a startling shade of green, but they were clouded with confusion and fear, like a spooked doze. She tried to pull away from his touch, a weak, reflexive motion of pure panic. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to softness. "Just water." She blinked, trying to focus on his face. She saw the scar, the weathered skin, the unreadable expression in his gray eyes. He was a stranger, a man, and men were the source of all her trouble. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up on trembling elbows. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Name's Luke McAllister. This is my land you're on." He did not say it as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. He corked his canteen and stood up, creating a less intimidating distance between them. He gestured vaguely toward the foothills behind him. "My cabin's not far. There's a fire and food, if you want it." Sarah stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion. Kindness was a currency she no longer trusted. It was always traded for something, a debt, an obligation, a silent demand. The preacher in Redemption had spoken of kindness, all while his eyes condemned her. The banker, Mr. Carver, had offered his condolences for Jedediah with a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. This man's offer felt just as dangerous. "I don't have any money," she said, the words tasting of ash and shame. It was the first defense that came to her mind. Luke's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. He had seen that look on her face before, on beaten men and lost souls who believed their worth could be measured in coins. "Didn't ask for any," he replied flatly. He picked up the locket and the folded letter, holding them out to her. "These are yours, I reckon." Her hand shot out, snatching them from his grasp with a desperate quickness. She pressed them to her chest, a protective gesture that was both fierce and fragile. In that small, unguarded movement, Luke saw not a grifter or an outlaw's woman, but a person stripped of everything but two small tokens of a life that was gone. And then he saw the tears. They did not fall in a great rush, but welled up in her haunted green eyes and slipped, one by one, down her dirt-streaked cheeks, carving clean paths in the grime. She made no sound, a silent grief that was more profound than any wail. The sight disarmed him completely. It cut through the calloused walls he had built around himself. He had seen death and violence, faced down men with murder in their eyes, but he had no defense against this quiet, shattering sorrow. He turned away for a moment, giving her a small measure of privacy, and looked back at the setting sun. The last sliver of red was sinking below the horizon, and the long, deep shadows of dusk were claiming the prairie. The night would bring the cold and the coyotes. Leaving her here was not an option. Not anymore. "The offer stands," he said, his back still to her. "Food, a roof for the night, nothing more to it. You can be on your way come morning." He walked over to his horse, expecting her to refuse. He expected her to stay right where she was, broken and proud, until the cold seeped into her bones. He heard a faint rustle behind him. When he turned, she was on her feet, swaying slightly, her arms wrapped around herself. She was looking at him with an expression of raw desperation, a war between terror and a primal need for sanctuary. I cannot walk any farther," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Luke gave a short, decisive nod. Without another word, he moved to her side, bent down, and swept her up into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. She stiffened at the contact, a gasp catching in her throat, but she was too weak to struggle. He carried her to Dust Devil and lifted her onto the saddle with an ease that spoke of immense strength, then swung up behind her. "Hold on," he said gruffly. Sarah's hands fluttered, uncertain where to go. She finally settled them on the saddle horn, her knuckles white. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the first human contact she had felt in weeks that was not a shove or a pitying pat, and it was so foreign, so overwhelming, that she felt another wave of tears threatening to fall. She squeezed her eyes shut and fought them back, focusing on the rhythmic plodding of the horse as it carried her away from the lonely road and into the gathering dark. The cabin was more of a shack, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and stone. It was small, with only one room and a lean-to in the back for storage, but it was sturdy, built to withstand the punishing winds that swept down from the mountains. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast wilderness. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the Spartan interior. A simple cot stood against one wall, a rough wooden table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves holding tins of beans, sacks of flour, and coffee. Everything was meticulously clean and ordered. It was the home of a man who lived without fuss or excess. Luke set her down gently in one of the chairs by the fire. She immediately curled into herself, her arms crossed tight, as if trying to shrink away from the sudden warmth and light. He moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, adding a log to the fire, filling a pot with water from a bucket by the door and setting it on a hook over the flames. He did not speak to her, and she was grateful for the silence. It allowed her to breathe, to quell the frantic pounding of her heart. He placed a tin plate on the table in front of her. On it were 2 thick slices of venison jerky and a hard biscuit. It was simple, trail-worn food, but to Sarah, who had eaten nothing but a few wild berries for 2 days, it smelled like a feast. Still, she hesitated. Her stomach churned with a mixture of hunger and anxiety. "Eat," he said. It was not a question. He sat in the other chair, a deliberate space between them, and began to work a piece of leather with a small knife, his hands sure and steady. He seemed to be paying her no mind, but she could feel his awareness of her, a quiet, steady presence that was unnerving. She picked up the biscuit. It was hard as a rock. She dipped it into the mug of water he had placed beside her plate and took a small, tentative bite, then another. Slowly, cautiously, she began to eat, her hunger overriding her fear. The man, Luke, said nothing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the scrape of his knife on the leather, and her own quiet chewing. When she had finished, she pushed the plate away and wrapped her arms around herself again, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The warmth was making her drowsy, but sleep felt like a betrayal of the vigilance that had kept her alive. "Your husband?" Luke asked, his voice low, not breaking his focus on his work. "He looking for you?" The question was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of the room. Sarah flinched. "He is dead." Luke's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "I'm sorry to hear it." "Are you?" The words were out before she could stop them, sharp and bitter. She looked at him, a flash of her old fire returning to her eyes. "Or are you just wondering what sort of trouble I will bring to your door?" He finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. There was no pity in them, only a calm appraisal. "Trouble usually finds its own way to my door, ma'am. Does not need an invitation. I was just making sure there is not a man out there with a right to claim you." The word claim sent a chill down her spine. It was how Jedediah had always spoken of her. His wife, his property. "No one has that right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No one." Luke gave a slow nod and returned to his work. The silence stretched again, but now it was filled with unspoken things. He heard the story in her tone, the bitterness, the fear, the fierce, broken pride. He let some time pass before he spoke again. "You from Redemption?" She just nodded, her eyes still on the fire. "That is Carverstown," he said, his voice flat. Sarah's head snapped up. "You know him?" "I know of him," Luke corrected. "Silas Carver. Buys up land from folks who fall on hard times. Funny how many folks around him seem to fall on hard times." He set his leatherwork aside and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into the rugged planes of his face. "He has been trying to get his hands on the acreage that borders my southern pasture. Belongs to the Miller family. Old man Miller says Carver's been squeezing him on his bank loan, threatening to foreclose." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It was the same story, her story. "He did more than threaten us," she whispered. "He took everything. Jedediah. He made some bad wagers. The drought killed the corn. Mister. Carver held the note. He came to the farm, and when we could not pay, he said the farm was his. He said the law was on his side." Her voice broke. "Then the fire." She could not finish. The memory of the heat, the smell of burning pine, and her life turning to ash was too much. Luke listened without interruption, his expression grim. It all clicked into place. The grieving widow, the lost farm, the town controlled by a greedy banker. Her tragedy was not just a random act of misfortune. It had a name and a face, and that face was now turned in his direction. Her trouble was his trouble, whether he wanted it to be or not. He stood and walked over to the cot. He pulled the single wool blanket from it and brought it to her, draping it over her shoulders. She flinched at his proximity but did not pull away. The blanket was coarse and smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. "You can take the cot," he said. "I will sleep by the fire." "I cannot," she started to protest, but he cut her off. "You need rest more than I do." He turned away, ending the discussion, and began to lay out his bedroll on the floorboards near the hearth. Sarah watched him, a storm of confusion and exhaustion raging inside her. This man's simple, undemanding decency was more disorienting than any cruelty. He had asked for nothing, offered everything. She did not know what to make of him. She was too tired to try. Pulling the blanket tighter around her, she rose on unsteady feet and moved to the cot. She did not bother to remove her filthy dress. She lay down, curling into a tight ball, her back to him. Sleep pulled at her, heavy and insistent, but her mind would not quiet. The faces of the townsfolk swam in her memory, their eyes full of judgment, the smug, predatory smile of Silas Carver, the terrifying roar of the fire. Sometime later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the cabin was filled with a deep, quiet dark, she heard him stir. He rose and walked silently to the open doorway, standing silhouetted against the brilliant, star-dusted night sky. The prairie outside was alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful cry of a lone coyote. He stood there for a long time, just looking out at the vast, dark land. Sarah watched him, a shadow in the shadows. He seemed a part of it, as rugged and solitary as the mesas that rose in the distance. He was a man who knew his place in the world. She had lost hers completely. A wave of despair so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over her. It was a terrifying, bottomless feeling. She was adrift in a hostile world with nothing to hold on to. The words slipped from her, a whispered confession to the darkness. "I do not know where to go." Luke did not turn, but she knew he had heard her. His shoulders seemed to slump, just for a moment. He remained silent for another long minute, the stars wheeling above him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the small cabin, a steady anchor in the terrifying dark. "Then stay," he said gently, his words aimed at the night. "Stay till you find your way." The first week passed in a haze of sleep and hesitant meals. Sarah existed within the four walls of the cabin, moving from the cot to the chair by the fire. Her world shrunk to the barest essentials of survival. Luke granted her the gift of his absence, leaving before dawn with a quiet word and returning after dusk. His presence announced by the clink of his spurs on the porch. He would leave food for her on the table, a bowl of stew. Fresh bread he had baked in a small Dutch oven, and she would eat it after he had gone outside to tend to his horse for the night. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, their orbits carefully misaligned. But the land would not be ignored. It crept in through the open door, the scent of sagebrush after a rare morning dew, the sharp, clean air of the foothills, the unending expanse of the blue sky. It called to a part of her she thought was dead. One morning, instead of waiting inside, she stepped onto the porch. The sun was a blistering, white-hot coin in the sky, and a dry wind, relentless and steady, whipped loose strands of her hair across her face. It felt abrasive, but it also felt real. She watched Luke in the corral, his movements with his buckskin horse a kind of silent conversation, a dance of muscle and mutual respect. That day, she swept the cabin floor until it was spotless. The next, she tended to the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the cabin, her fingers finding a forgotten familiarity in the soil. Luke said nothing when he returned, but he left a pail of fresh water for the plants by the door. A quiet rhythm began to establish itself, built not on words, but on shared tasks. She started joining him for the morning chores. At first, she just carried buckets of feed for the two horses and the milk cow. Then, she learned the simple, repetitive task of mending a barbed wire fence, her hands, soft from a life indoors, quickly becoming chapped and calloused. He showed her how to hold the wire stretcher, how to wrap the new wire until it was taut, his large, scarred hands briefly brushing hers as he guided them. The touch was impersonal, practical, yet it sent a jolt through her that was both startling and strangely grounding. They worked for hours under the oppressive sun, the silence broken only by the snip of the wire cutters, the thud of the post driver, and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. In that silence, trust began to take root, a fragile seedling in scorched earth. She learned the landscape through his eyes. He would pause, pointing a gloved finger toward the lonely, flat-topped mesas that shimmered in the distance. "Good place to get turned around? Out there," was all he would say. But she understood the warning. At night, sitting on the porch, they would listen to the chorus of the prairie. The yip and howl of a wolf pack would drift down from the high country, a lonely, chilling sound that made her draw the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Luke seemed unconcerned. "They keep to themselves, long as you do," he said, and she found herself believing him. She was beginning to understand that out here, danger was honest. It did not hide behind polite smiles or whispered rumors. One afternoon, he brought out a gentle old mare, her coat the color of sun-bleached sand. "Her name's Daisy," he said. "Time you learn to get around on your own." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Sarah's stomach. Jedediah had never allowed her to ride. It was not a woman's place, he had said. but the look in Luke's eyes was patient, expectant. He helped her up, his hands firm and steady at her waist, and for a moment she was so acutely aware of his touch that she forgot to be afraid. He led the horse around the corral, his voice a low, calming rumble as he explained how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight, how to use her heels to urge the horse forward. "Look up, Sarah," he said, when he saw her staring down at her own trembling hands. "You cannot see where you are going if you are looking at your feet." She lifted her head, and the world expanded. From the back of the horse, she could see over the corral fence to the rolling plains beyond. She could feel the power of the animal beneath her, a living, breathing strength that she was, in some small way, a part of. A smile, the first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime, touched her lips. It felt like a foreign muscle coming back to life. Life settled into this new shape. The sharp edges of her grief began to soften, worn down by the daily grind of physical labor. The constant ache in her heart was still there, a dull throb beneath the surface, but it no longer consumed her. She was learning the difference between solitude and loneliness, here with Luke. The quiet was a comfort, a shared space. In redemption, the quiet had been the silence of judgment, of doors closing as she walked by. The first sign of the past's intrusion came with the weather. The sky, which had been a sheet of unbroken blue for weeks, began to curdle with gray clouds building up over the mountains to the west. A low, distant rumble echoed through the valley. Sarah was in the lean-to, sorting dried beans into canvas sacks. At the sound of the thunder, her hands froze. The small metal scoop fell from her fingers, clattering on the packed dirt floor. Another rumble, this one closer, vibrated through the soles of her worn boots. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. The air in the small space suddenly felt thick, suffocating. The smell of dust and dried goods was replaced by the phantom stench of smoke, of burning wood and scorched cloth. Luke, coming in from the corral, found her pressed against the back wall, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. She was pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough-hewn planks of the wall. She was trembling uncontrollably. He stopped in the doorway, understanding dawning in his eyes. The fire, the thunder, deep and low like the roar of an inferno, had thrown her back into that night. He did not rush to her, did not touch her. He simply stood there, his presence a quiet, solid anchor. "It is just a storm, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and even. "A bit of rain. The land needs it." His voice cut through the fog of her memory. She blinked, her gaze slowly focusing on him. She saw not judgment, not impatience, but a deep, somber understanding in his gray eyes. The shaking began to subside, leaving her feeling weak and hollowed out. She slid down the wall to sit on a sack of flour, burying her face in her hands, ashamed of her weakness. He did not press her. He simply went about his tasks, securing the barn door, checking the latches on the corral gate. His calm competence a silent reassurance that this, too, would pass. The storm broke with a fury, rain lashing against the cabin, but inside, a different kind of storm had been weathered. It was the need for supplies that finally forced them from their self-contained world. The coffee was gone, the flour was low, and Luke needed a new axe head. He announced his intention to ride into Redemption at breakfast. "I will go alone," he said, not looking at her. "No need for you to—" He trailed off, leaving the reason unspoken. "No," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I am not a child to be hidden away. I need thread and soap." The words were a declaration. She would not live in fear. She had been surviving on his ranch. It was time to start living again. Luke looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. The ride into town was tense. As they drew closer, Sarah could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Redemption looked the same, A single dusty main street lined with clapboard buildings, a church steeple rising at one end, a saloon at the other, but it felt different. Before, she had been a part of it. However, unhappily. Now, she was an outsider, an object of gossip and scorn. They tied their horses in front of the mercantile. As Luke and Sarah stepped onto the boardwalk, a hush fell over the small group of men gathered there. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed them. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the door in front of her, her back straight, her chin high. She could feel the weight of their stares like a physical pressure. Inside, the store was dim and smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man who had always been kind to her, now could not quite meet her eye. He busied himself rearranging a stack of tins as they entered. Luke, seemingly oblivious to the tension, handed his list to the shopkeeper, and a new axe head, if you have one. As Luke discussed the merits of different brands of steel with Mr. Henderson, Sarah moved toward the back of the store, where the bolts of fabric and sewing notions were kept. She tried to focus on the simple task of choosing thread, her fingers tracing the different colors on the spools. It was then that she heard the voices from the next aisle. They were low, but clear in the quiet store. "Look at her!" The voice of Martha Carver, the banker's wife, dripped with venomous piety. "Not even a month since her husband's in the ground, and she's already latched onto another one. Shameless." "I heard that McAllister fellow is a recluse." Another woman, the preacher's wife, added, "Keeps to himself. She must have spun him some kind of tale. They say she drove poor Jedediah to drink and ruin with her cold ways." "Drove him into his grave, more like." "Mrs." Carver said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And now she is out at that ranch, unchaperoned, living in sin. She is a plague on this town, a disgrace to decent women. She will be the downfall of that man, too. Mark my words." Every word was a physical blow, a plague, a disgrace, downfall. The air was stolen from Sarah's lungs. The spools of thread blurred before her eyes. The shame was a hot, suffocating tide, rising up her throat. She was not just a widow. She was a pariah, a curse, and now she had brought that curse to the one person who had shown her kindness. She was tainting him, ruining his name, pulling him down into the muck with her. She turned, her movement stiff and jerky, and fled. She did not look at Luke. She did not look at anyone. She pushed past the swinging doors and out into the harsh sunlight, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She ran, heedless of the shocked faces she passed, her only thought to get away, to disappear, to erase the stain of her existence from Luke's life. She did not stop until she reached the river that flowed at the edge of town, her lungs burning, her side aching. She collapsed onto the grassy bank, hidden from the road by a thicket of willows, and finally let the tears come. They were not the silent tears Luke had seen before, but wrenching, guttural sobs of self-loathing and despair. She had been a fool to think she could start over. Her past was a brand on her soul, and everyone could see it. Luke found her there minutes later. He had seen her flee, had seen the smug, satisfied look on Martha Carver's face. He had paid for his goods, his movements dangerously quiet, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones, and had followed her. He found her huddled by the water's edge, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. He stood for a moment, watching her, his own heart a tight, painful knot in his chest. He walked over and sat on the ground a few feet away, not speaking, just letting his presence be known. After a long while, her sobbing subsided into shuddering breaths. She did not look at him. She stared at the flowing water as if it held the answers to an impossible question. "I bring only bad luck," she murmured, her voice thick with tears. "They are right. I ruined Jedediah, and now I am ruining you." Luke picked up a flat, smooth stone and sent it skipping across the water's surface. 1, 2, 3 times before it sank. "My reputation is my own business," he said, his voice low and even. "It has weathered worse than a few gossiping hens." He paused, then turned to look at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "And as for your luck..." He moved closer, kneeling in the grass beside her. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the deep lines of care and sorrow etched into his face. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to hold his hand, palm up, in the space between them. It was an offering, an invitation. "Then let me share it." The words were spoken so gently, so simply, that they bypassed all her defenses and went straight to the broken core of her. He was not dismissing her pain or her fear. He was accepting it. He was offering to stand with her in the wreckage, to take on the weight of her curse as if it were his own. It was the most profound act of grace she had ever known. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but this one was different. It was not born of shame or grief, but of a fragile, aching gratitude. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a widow, not as a sinner, not as a burden, but as Sarah. She looked from his outstretched hand to his face, and in that long, silent moment, something shifted between them. A connection, forged in shared pain and quiet understanding, sparked to life a slow, deep, and undeniable longing. The sky had been darkening as they sat, the same storm that had haunted her earlier now gathering its full strength. A low rumble of thunder rolled toward them, and a cool wind rustled the willow leaves. Luke stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "We need to go." They rode hard, the storm chasing them, the wind whipping at their clothes. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as they reached the ranch. By the time they got the horses under cover in the barn, the sky had opened up. Rain fell in solid, deafening sheets, and lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. There was no question of making a dash for the cabin. They were trapped. Luke lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the gloom of the barn. The space was filled with the warm, earthy smells of hay, animals, and rain-soaked earth. They stood in silence, listening to the fury of the storm outside. Sarah leaned against a support beam, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the rain sluice down the barn's small, grimy window. The thunder still made her flinch, but the terror was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The world outside was in chaos, but in here, with him, she felt safe. Luke stood near the large barn doors, staring out at the deluge. He, too, was wrestling with his own ghosts, memories stirred by the violence of the storm and the raw emotion of the day. He thought of another fight, another time the world had exploded in noise and violence, leaving him with a scar on his soul that no one could see. He glanced over at Sarah, her profile illuminated by a flash of lightning. He saw the strength that lay beneath her fragility, the courage it had taken for her to face that town, the profound injustice of her suffering. What had started as an act of reluctant compassion had deepened into something far more complicated, something that was beginning to feel dangerously like hope. The storm raged on, a wild symphony of wind and water. Inside the barn, two solitary souls stood together in the lantern light, their shared silence a testament to all the words they did not yet know how to say. They were no longer just a man and a woman, a rescuer and a victim. They were two people, bound by a quiet understanding, taking shelter from the same storm. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. In the quiet aftermath, a new intimacy settled between them in the barn's lantern-lit gloom. The raw emotion of the day, stripped bare by the town's cruelty and his quiet defense, had raised the remaining fences between them. They were no longer just two people sharing a space. They were two people who had seen the bottom of each other's sorrow. They returned to the cabin in a shared silence, the ground sucking at their boots. As Sarah prepared a simple meal, she found her eyes drawn to the faint, silvery scar that cut through Luke's eyebrow. It was a part of his face she had come to know well, a permanent mark of some past violence that he never spoke of. "How did you get your scar?" she asked, her voice soft in the still room. Luke, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, paused. His hands, usually so sure and steady, hesitated for a moment. He ran a thumb over the mark, a reflexive, unconscious gesture. He looked not at her, but into the fire, as if the story were written in the flames. "Cattle feud," he said, his voice a low rumble. "About 5 years back, up on the Red River, I was working for a rancher named Abernathy. A man named Dawson decided the stretch of grazing land Abernathy used was his. It was not. He just had more men and fewer scruples." He fell silent, the rhythmic click of the cleaning rod the only sound. Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "It went on for months," he continued, his voice tight. "Cutting fences, spooking herds. One day, Dawson and 2 of his hands tried to drive off a part of our herd. We rode out to meet them. There was shouting. Abernathy was an old man, but proud. Dawson pulled his pistol. I was faster." He stopped cleaning the rifle and set it down carefully. The firelight flickered in his gray eyes, now dark with memory. "He drew on me. I had no choice, but a choice made in a heartbeat is one you have a lifetime to live with. I killed him." He finally looked at her, and she saw the raw, unhealed guilt that haunted him. It was self-defense. The law saw it that way, but the taking of a man's life, Sarah, it leaves a hollow place inside you, a scar you can feel even when you cannot see it. His confession was a key, unlocking a door inside her she had kept bolted for years. His vulnerability, the admission of a pain that was not physical but etched onto his soul, gave her the courage to voice her own. "Jedediah," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "The women in town, they were not entirely wrong. I was his downfall, just not in the way they think." She took a shaky breath. "He was not always a cruel man. When we first married, he was hopeful, but the land is hard, and hope does not last long out here without a spine to hold it up. The drought came, the debts grew, and he started to drink. The drink made him mean." She looked up, her eyes pleading for him to understand. He would come back from town, his pockets empty from cards, and the failure would be a rage inside him, a rage he would spend on me. She did not need to give details. The way she flinched from a raised voice, the way she made herself small when she felt she was in the way, it all made a terrible kind of sense to him now. "I would see the bruises in the morning and feel such shame," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But the shame was not just from the hurt. It was because I stayed. The preacher always said a wife's duty is to her husband. In all things, to leave him would have been a sin in the eyes of God and everyone in town. It would have been my failure, my fault. So I stayed. I prayed. I tried to be a better wife, but nothing I did was ever enough. I stayed until there was nothing left of him but cruelty, and nothing left of me at all." She finally broke, a quiet, shuddering sob escaping her. Luke moved from his chair and knelt before her, just as he had by the river. He did not touch her. He just waited. When she finally looked at him, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only a profound, aching sorrow for what she had endured, and a fierce, quiet anger at the man who had inflicted it and the world that had allowed it. "That was not your shame, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "The shame was his, and it was theirs, for turning a blind eye." In the days that followed, something fundamental shifted. His gentle patience became a balm on her wounded spirit. He started asking for her opinion on things, whether to move the herd to the west pasture, the best place to dig a new irrigation ditch. At first, she was hesitant, her own thoughts and feelings having been dismissed for so long they felt foreign. But he would wait, listening intently as she spoke, and a small, forgotten part of her began to stir. Her self-worth, trampled into the dust for years, began to tentatively, cautiously, reclaim its ground. He was not trying to fix her. He was simply giving her the space to heal herself. Meanwhile, in the town of Redemption, Silas Carver sat in his office at the bank, a cloud of cigar smoke hanging over his polished oak desk. The news from his wife about Sarah's appearance at the Mercantile had been an unwelcome surprise. He had presumed the widow, broken and destitute, had either perished on the prairie or fled back east. Her survival was an inconvenience. Her presence on Luke McAllister's land was a threat. McAllister was a stubborn, solitary man who refused to be intimidated, a significant obstacle to Carver's plans to acquire all the land in the valley. "She is the key," Carver murmured to the sheriff, a man whose pockets he lined with enough silver to ensure his loyalty. "As long as she is out there, she is a loose end, a witness to Jedediah's desperation." The sheriff shifted his weight. "What do you want me to do, Mr. Carver?" "McAllister is not breaking any laws by letting her stay there." Carver smiled, a cold, thin expression. "That is where you are wrong. A vulnerable, grieving widow, taken in by a known recluse with a violent past. It is a story that writes itself. He has taken advantage of her fragile state. He is holding her against her will. He kidnapped her. You will find there is a great deal of public sentiment for rescuing a helpless woman from the clutches of such a man." The lie spread through town like a prairie fire, fanned by the whispers of the righteous and the self-interested. Martha Carver and the preacher's wife spoke of it in hushed, horrified tones. Men who owed Carver money suddenly felt a surge of civic duty. Luke McAllister, the quiet rancher, was recast as a predator. Sarah, the disgraced widow, was transformed into a tragic victim in need of saving. The sound came on a hot, still afternoon, a low rumble that was not thunder. Luke heard it first, his head coming up from the trough he was repairing. He squinted at the horizon. A plume of dust was rising from the direction of the main road. It was too large for a single rider. "Sarah!" he called, his voice sharp, devoid of its usual calm. "Get in the cabin. Lock the door." She saw the dust cloud, the grim set of his jaw, and did not argue. She ran inside, her heart pounding, and slid the heavy wooden bolt across the door. She peered through a small crack in the shutters, her breath held tight in her chest. A group of about a dozen men on horseback rode into the yard, their horses kicking up dust and trampling the hard-packed earth. They were not a formal posse. They were a mob. Farmers, ranch hands, men she recognized from town. At their head was a rancher named Tom Pullman, a man who owed a great deal of money to Carver's bank. Luke did not move from the center of the yard. He simply stood there, his hands loose at his sides, watching them approach. He looked solid, immovable, like one of the great oaks that grew by the river. "McAllister," Pullman called out, his voice unnaturally loud. "We have come for the widow. We have reason to believe you are holding her here against her will." Luke's expression did not change. "You have bad information. She is here by her own choice." "We will hear it from her. Then," another man shouted, "bring her out!" "No," Luke said. The word was flat, final. "You are not welcome on my land. You have no authority here. Turn your horses around and ride out." He took a slow step backward, toward the cabin porch where his shotgun was leaning against the wall. The movement was deliberate, a clear warning. The men in the mob shifted uneasily, their bravado wavering in the face of his cold calm. Pullman's face flushed with anger. "Do not make this difficult, McAllister. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Give us the woman." "The only way you will set foot in that cabin is over my dead body," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. He reached the porch and his hand closed around the stock of the shotgun. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The confrontation hung in the air, thick and volatile as black powder. From inside, Sarah watched, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. This was because of her. These men, their faces twisted with self-righteous anger, were here because of her. A young, nervous-looking man near the back of the group flinched. His horse shied, and his finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. A shot rang out, loud and shocking in the tense silence. It went wide, splintering the wood of the porch railing inches from Luke's head. Instinct took over. Luke raised the shotgun and fired one barrel into the air, a deafening blast meant to spook the horses and scatter the men. Chaos erupted. Horses reared and whinnied. Men shouted in confusion and anger. Another shot was fired, this one aimed with more malice. It did not hit Luke. It hit Daisy, the gentle old mare, who was standing in the nearby corral. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pain and terror, and collapsed in a heap, her legs kicking feebly in the dust. A profound silence fell over the yard, broken only by the mare's dying gasps. The sight of the innocent animal, struck down in the crossfire, seemed to drain the fury from the mob. Their righteous cause was suddenly stained with a senseless, ugly act of cruelty. Pullman looked from the dying horse to the cold, murderous rage that had finally entered Luke's eyes. "Let us go," Pullman said, his voice hoarse. He wheeled his horse around. The others, ashamed and unnerved, followed suit. They rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a dead horse and a shattered piece. Luke did not move until they were gone. He slowly lowered the shotgun. He walked to the corral, his movements stiff. He looked down at Daisy, at the life fading from her soft brown eyes, and a muscle worked in his jaw. Sarah watched him through the shutter, and her heart broke. The kindness he had shown her, the sanctuary he had built, had been violated. And she was the cause. His horse, the gentle creature he had used to teach her freedom, was dead because of her. The whispers of the townswomen echoed in her mind. A plague, a disgrace, the downfall of that man. That night was the longest of her life. Luke dealt with the dead horse, his face a mask of stone. He did not speak when he finally came inside. He sat by the cold hearth, staring into the darkness, the shotgun resting across his knees. The silence in the cabin was heavy, filled with grief and the unspoken threat of what was to come. They would be back. Carver would not let this go. Sarah lay on the cot, feigning sleep, her mind racing. She had brought this violence to his door. She had cost him his peace, his property, his safety. She had seen the look in his eyes when Daisy fell. It was the same look he'd had when he spoke of killing a man, the look of a soul being scarred. She could not bear to be the cause of another scar. If she stayed, he would have to keep fighting. He might be hurt, he might be killed. All for her. The thought was unbearable. There was only one thing to do. When his breathing finally deepened into the fitful sleep of exhaustion, she slipped from the cot. Her movements were silent as a ghost's. She gathered the few things that were truly hers, the locket, the folded letter. She would take nothing else. She found a small piece of charcoal from the hearth and a scrap of wrapping paper. By the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she wrote her message. Her hand shook, and a single tear fell, smudging the charcoal on the paper. She folded it and left it on the table where he would see it. She crept to the door and slid the bolt back with painstaking slowness. The night air was cool on her face. She gave one last look back at the sleeping form of the man who had shown her kindness, who had offered to share her bad luck. Her heart felt as if it were being torn from her chest. "Do not lose everything because of me," she whispered into the darkness. Then she turned and slipped out into the night, a lone figure moving east, toward the vast, unforgiving desert. Luke awoke with a start just before dawn. The cabin felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. He sat up. The cot across the room was empty, the blanket folded neatly. A cold dread washed over him. On the table, a small, folded piece of paper caught the first gray light of morning. He picked it up. His hands, which could calm a wild horse or aim a rifle with perfect stillness, trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The message was short, the charcoal letters blurred by a single tear. "Thank you for showing me kindness. Don't lose everything because of me." He crushed the paper in his fist. A low, guttural sound of raw anguish escaped him. He stood, his movements sharp and immediate. There was no hesitation, no deliberation. He strode to the barn, saddled Dust Devil with a grim efficiency, and checked the load in his Winchester. He picked up her trail easily, the faint footprints of a woman walking alone, heading straight into the barren lands to the east where there was nothing but sun, rock, and death. He spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of grim resolve, his gray eyes fixed on the trail that was all he had left of her. He would find her. He would not let the desert, or Silas Carver, or her own broken heart, take her from him. The desert was a crucible. By day, the sun was a merciless hammer, beating down from a white-hot sky, bleaching the world of color and life. By night, the cold was a physical presence, seeping through Sarah's thin dress and into her bones. She walked east, away from the sunrise, as if she could outpace the dawn of a new day she did not want to face. Her feet, which had just begun to heal, were once again a mass of blisters and raw skin. She survived on the charity of the land, a few bitter roots she recognized from her childhood, a handful of prickly pear fruit that she painstakingly peeled with a sharp rock, its sweet juice a fleeting relief from the constant, gnawing thirst. She did not think of it as survival. She thought of it as atonement. Each pang of hunger, each sharp pain from her feet, was a payment on the debt she owed Luke. The memory of Daisy, the gentle mare, collapsing in the dust was a brand on her mind. She had brought death to his sanctuary. This suffering was just and right. It was the price for his peace. After 3 days that felt like an eternity, she stumbled upon a new town. It was not a town like Redemption, with a church steeple and tidy houses. This place was called Prospect, and it had the raw, temporary feel of a wound on the landscape. It was a collection of tents, clapboard shacks, and a few larger, false-fronted buildings, all clinging to the side of a dusty, wind-scoured gulch. It was a town of men, miners with hollow eyes and calloused hands, cowboys spending their pay on cheap whiskey, and gamblers whose faces showed nothing at all. Her appearance, a lone woman in a torn black dress covered in the grime of the desert, drew immediate and unwelcome attention. Men stopped and stared, their eyes lingering on her with a predatory curiosity. She kept her head down, her only goal to find work, any work that would provide a meal and a roof, however squalid. She was turned away from the assayer's office, the dry goods store, and the boarding house. They looked at her ragged state and saw only trouble. Only one door remained open to her, the Golden Spur Saloon. The sound from within was a roar, a tinny piano struggling to be heard over shouts, coarse laughter, and the clink of glasses. The air that billowed out smelled of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. It was the last place on earth she wanted to enter, but her body, trembling with exhaustion and hunger, gave her no choice. A woman with hair the color of rust and a face as hard as a dried riverbed stood behind the bar, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. She looked Sarah up and down, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "What do you want?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "Work," Sarah said, the word barely a whisper. "I will do anything, sweep, scrub, anything." The woman, whose name was May, laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Honey, the only work for a woman in a place like this is not sweeping floors." She paused, studying Sarah's face, seeing the profound, bone-deep desperation in her eyes. She saw a fellow survivor, albeit one much farther down the ladder. With a sigh, she tossed the rag onto the bar. The rooms upstairs need cleaning every morning. It is filthy work for almost no pay, but it comes with a cot in the back storeroom and one meal a day. You start at sunrise. And so, Sarah's world shrank to the size of the Golden Spur Saloon. Her life became a cycle of grime and noise. She rose before dawn, the silence of that hour her only reprieve, and cleaned the upstairs rooms. She scrubbed floors sticky with spilled liquor, emptied spittoons, and changed sheets that smelled of unwashed bodies and cheap perfume. The rest of the day, she was expected to help May behind the bar, collecting empty glasses and wiping down tables, moving like a ghost through the raucous crowd. The place was thick with a casual cruelty she had never experienced. The men treated her not as a person, but as part of the furniture, something to be used and discarded. They called her Blackbird because of her dress. Their hands would brush against her as she passed, a lingering, proprietary touch on her arm or the small of her back. Their comments were low and crude, spoken with a leer, assuming she was for sale like the whiskey and the cards. She endured it all with a quiet, hollow resignation. Each insult, each unwelcome touch, was another confirmation of her worthlessness. This, she believed, was where she belonged. This was the fate of a woman who brought ruin to good men. She built a wall inside herself, a place of cold emptiness where their words and actions could not reach the last, flickering ember of the woman she used to be. She deserved no better. This was her penance. While Sarah sank into the mire of Prospect, Luke rode with a relentless, grim fury. He pushed Dust Devil to the edge of endurance, his own need for food and rest an afterthought. His world had narrowed to a single, obsessive purpose, the faint tracks she had left in the sand. He was a man accustomed to the subtle language of the land, and he read the story of her journey in the scuffed earth. He saw where she had stumbled, where she had stopped to rest, where she had dug for roots. He saw her desperation, and it fueled his own. He stopped at every isolated homestead and dusty outpost, his question always the same. Have you seen a woman, traveling alone, in a black dress? Most shook their heads, but in a small, wind-blown trading post, an old prospector remembered, saw a woman looked half dead walking toward Prospect 2 days back, he'd said. Figured the desert would claim her before she got there. The name of the town hit Luke like a physical blow. Prospect, a hellhole known for trouble and desperation. The fear that had been a cold knot in his gut now became a raging fire. He spurred his horse on, his face set like granite. Back in the Golden Spur, Sarah's fragile peace was about to be shattered. A ranch hand named Clay, a big belligerent man with a mean drunk streak, had lost his entire month's pay at the poker table, furious and looking for someone to blame. His eyes landed on Sarah as she cleared glasses from a nearby table. In his liquor-soaked mind, she was the perfect target for his rage. A silent, defenseless woman who existed on the fringes, someone no one would miss. Later that night, as she was heading to her small cot in the storeroom, he cornered her in the narrow, dimly lit hallway upstairs. He blocked her path, a predatory smile on his face. "Well now, Blackbird," he slurred, his breath sour with whiskey. "Where are you flying off to in such a hurry?" Sarah froze, her heart seizing in her chest. "Please," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "Let me pass." "I think you and me ought to get better acquainted," he said, reaching out and grabbing her arm. His grip was like an iron band. "I paid good money in this place tonight. I figure I'm owed a little hospitality." The touch, the smell of him, the look in his eyes, it was Jedediah all over again, but stripped of any pretense of marriage or duty. This was a raw, brutal assertion of power. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong. He shoved her back against the wall. the impact knocking the air from her lungs. "Do not fight me," he growled, his face close to hers. "You work here. You know what that means." But something inside Sarah, something that had been forged in the quiet strength of Luke's ranch, refused to break. She was not just Jedediah's victim anymore. She was a woman who had learned to mend a fence, to ride a horse, to look at the horizon and not feel afraid. As he fumbled with the collar of her dress, her eyes darted around, frantic, searching. Her gaze fell on an empty whiskey bottle sitting on a crate in the hall. In one desperate, fluid motion, she broke free from his grasp, snatched the bottle, and swung it with all her might against the wall. It shattered, leaving the jagged neck in her hand. Clay stared at the makeshift weapon, his drunken haze momentarily clearing in surprise. Then he laughed. "You got some fire in you after all." He lunged for her. She did not scream. A cold, clear instinct for survival took over. As his hands closed on her, she thrust the broken bottle forward, not aiming, just pushing him away. The jagged glass sliced across his forearm. He bellowed in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, clutching his arm as blood welled up, dark and thick in the lantern light. The noise brought May running from downstairs, followed by the town's part-time sheriff, a portly man named Gable, who spent most of his evenings in the saloon. They found Clay clutching his bleeding arm, and Sarah pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with shock, the broken bottle still clutched in her trembling hand. "She attacked me!" Clay roared, his voice filled with outrage. "The crazy witch just attacked me for no reason!" Sheriff Gable looked from the bleeding man to the silent, terrified woman. In a town like Prospect, the story was simple. A drunken but paying customer had been assaulted by the saloon's strange, silent cleaning woman. He saw a problem that needed a simple solution. "Drop the bottle, ma'am," he said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Sarah's fingers went numb, and the jagged glass fell to the floor with a clatter. She did not protest. She did not try to explain. The wall of emptiness she had built inside herself slammed shut. It was just as she had always known. She was a plague, a danger. It was her fault. Gable took her by the arm and led her downstairs, through the now silent, staring crowd, and out into the night. He locked her in the town's only jail cell, a small, filthy room with a single cot and a barred window that looked out onto a trash-strewn alley. She was officially charged with assault, accused of being a dangerous woman. The iron door slammed shut, and she was once again lost in the dark. Luke rode into Prospect the next afternoon. The town was even worse than he had imagined. He tied Dust Devil in front of the sheriff's office and walked into the Golden Spur, his eyes scanning the room. He ignored the curious stares. His presence, quiet, armed, and radiating a cold intensity, silencing the usual noise. He walked straight to the bar. "I am looking for a woman," he said to May. "Black dress, name Sarah." May's hard expression softened with a flicker of something that might have been regret. "You are a day too late. Mister, she is in the jailhouse." She nodded toward the sheriff's office. "Got herself in some trouble last night." Luke's blood ran cold. He turned without another word and strode across the street. He found Sheriff Gable sitting with his boots up on his desk. "I am here about the woman you arrested last night," Luke said, his voice level but with an unmistakable edge. "Sarah?" Gable lowered his feet. "And who are you?" "A friend," Luke said. "I want to see her." The sheriff led him to the cell. Luke saw her through the bars, huddled on the cot, her face turned to the wall. She was so still he thought for a moment she was not breathing. She was thinner, her face gaunt, her dress even more tattered. The sight of her, so broken and alone, filled him with a rage so pure and cold it was almost blinding. "Sarah," he said softly. She flinched at the sound of his voice. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, they were the same hollow, haunted eyes of the woman he had found collapsed by the creek. The fragile progress, the healing, the tentative smiles. all of it was gone, erased.
"Luke,"
she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, his gaze locked on hers. He turned to the sheriff. "What is her bail?" Gable shrugged. $50, and Clay is pressing charges. She is not going anywhere.
"She was defending herself,"
Luke stated, his voice low and dangerous.
"You know it and I know it."
"All I know is I got a man with his arm sliced open and a woman holding the weapon," Gable retorted. $50. Take it or leave it." Luke pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt and counted out the coins onto the sheriff's desk. It was nearly everything he had. Gable, surprised, slowly unlocked the cell door. The door swung open with a groan. Sarah did not move. She just stared at Luke, her expression one of profound despair. When she finally rose and stepped out, she looked fragile enough to break. She stopped in front of him, not daring to look him in the eye. "You shouldn't have come," she said weakly, the words a ghost of a breath. He reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were filled with a fierce, unwavering tenderness. "You said you were lost," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I am here to take you home." He led her out of the jailhouse and into the harsh afternoon sun. He put her on his horse, then swung up behind her, his arms a protective circle around her, as they rode out of Prospect, leaving the noise and the cruelty behind. She finally allowed herself to lean back against his solid strength. The public scorn, the whispers, the danger. None of it mattered now. He had come for her. He had called his ranch her home. The tension between them was a powerful, unspoken current, a love born not of words or promises, but forged in ruin and rescue. A silent, undeniable truth in the vast, empty landscape. The ride back to the ranch was a long, quiet journey through a world that now felt hostile and alien. The peace Sarah had found in the vast, empty landscapes was gone, replaced by a constant, prickling awareness of their isolation. They were marked now, not just by their own pasts, but by a shared public scorn. Luke's arm, wrapped protectively around her, was a solid, reassuring presence, but even that could not ward off the chill of what was to come. Their return confirmed their status as pariahs. Redemption, once a place of mere judgment, now treated them with open hostility. When Luke rode in for grain, Mr. Henderson at the mercantile suddenly found himself short on stock. The blacksmith, a man Luke had known for years, was too busy to shoe his horse. Old acquaintances averted their eyes and crossed the street to avoid him. They were ghosts in a town that had decided they no longer existed. Worse, Silas Carver began his assault in earnest. A notice, penned in the precise, elegant script of a lawyer, was posted on Luke's gate. It was a formal challenge to his property line, citing a newly discovered discrepancy in the original survey. It was a lie, a fabrication designed to bleed him dry with legal fees and uncertainty. Then, small acts of sabotage began. A section of his fence was cut in the night, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off into the canyons, costing Luke 3 days of hard riding to recover them. He grew quieter, more grim. A deep, weary anger settled in his eyes. He spent his days riding the perimeter of his land, his Winchester always in his hand, and his nights staring into the fire, the weight of the siege pressing down on him. He was trying to shield Sarah from it, to bear the entire burden himself. But she saw the toll it was taking. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders and the new lines of strain around his mouth. The woman who had returned from Prospect was not the same one who had fled into the desert. The hollow shell of a victim had been filled with a quiet, tempered steel. She had been rescued, but in being rescued, she had found the will to fight. She would not be the cause of his ruin. She would be his partner in defiance. "This is because of me," she said one evening, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen between them. He was cleaning his shotgun. his movements methodical and tense. "This is because of Carver," he corrected, his voice flat. "He would have come for this land eventually. You just gave him his excuse." "An excuse I will not let him use," she replied, her voice firm. She came and stood before him, forcing him to look up. "I will not hide in this cabin while he destroys you. Luke, I am done hiding. I am done being afraid." A flicker of surprise, of admiration, showed in his eyes. "What do you mean to do?" "Jedediah kept papers," she said, her mind working, piecing together fragments of memory. "He was not a careful man, but he was suspicious. He kept all the loan agreements from Mr. Carver in a lockbox. I saw them. After he died, I remember thinking his signature looked different on the last one, shaky on the loan papers, but the bill of sale for the livestock was too neat, too clean." Her eyes met his, a plan forming within them. "Those papers burned with the house, but the official records are in the courthouse. I want to see them." He was reluctant, the thought of her facing that town again galling him, but he saw the unyielding resolve in her face, and he knew he could not stop her. "All right," he said with a slow nod. "We will go together." They rode into Redemption the next morning, two solitary figures moving through a town that watched them with 100 hostile eyes. They ignored the whispers, the doors that quietly shut as they passed. They walked with their heads held high, a silent, united front. The courthouse was a small, stuffy building that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk, a mousy man who owed his position to Carver, paled when they entered. "We are here to see the land deeds and loan agreements for the farm of Jedediah Cole," Luke said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the clerk scurry to the records room. As they waited, the door opened, and Silas Carver walked in. He feigned surprise, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his lips. Well, Mr. McAllister, and the widow Cole, to what do we owe this pleasure? Have you come to your senses and decided to sell?" "We have come to see the proof of your fraud," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. The sound of her own courage surprised her. Carver's smile tightened. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "You foolish girl." The clerk returned, his arms laden with dusty ledgers, which he placed on a large table. Sarah began to pore over them, her finger tracing the columns of figures, her memory sharp and clear. Luke stood behind her, a silent, watchful guardian. She found it, the final loan agreement, the one that had cost them everything, and beside it, the deed transfer, signed over to the bank. "There," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. She pointed to the signature on the loan. "That is my husband's hand. See how the J is unsteady? He had been drinking that day. He could barely hold the pen." Then she pointed to the deed. "But this is not his. It is a perfect signature, a forger's hand. You got him to sign a blank paper, or you traced his name. His debts were a lie, a setup to steal his land, our land." She looked up, not just at Carver, but at the handful of onlookers who had gathered in the courthouse, drawn by the prospect of a confrontation. Her voice rose, filled with the righteous anger she had suppressed for so long. "You are a thief and a liar, Mr. Carver." Carver's face, usually so composed, became a mask of pure fury. His public image, his carefully constructed reputation as a town elder, was being dismantled by a woman he had written off as a nobody. He lashed out with the most vicious weapon he had. "A liar?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You dare to call me a liar? You, a woman of no account, a barren wife who drove her husband to his grave and then immediately took up with another man? You are a fallen woman, a harlot who has bewitched this poor fool. Your words are worthless. You are worthless." The crowd murmured, their sympathies easily swayed by the familiar, ugly accusations. A few men took a step forward, their expressions turning menacing. The air grew thick and ugly. Before Sarah could even flinch, Luke was there. He moved in front of her, not with aggression, but with a quiet, absolute finality that brought the crowd to a halt. He did not look at Carver. He looked at the faces in the crowd, his gray eyes sweeping over them, cold with contempt.
"You should all be ashamed," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "This woman has lost everything, and you stood by and watched. You listened to whispers and gossip instead of the truth. You let this man," he gestured dismissively at Carver, "poison your minds because it was easier than standing up for what is right. Her name is Sarah. She is a good and honorable woman, and she is under my protection. If any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me." He held their gaze for a long, silent moment. Men who had felt brave in a mob suddenly could not meet his eyes. They shuffled their feet, their righteous anger deflating into shame. Luke turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "Let us go home." He led her out of the courthouse, the crowd parting before them like the sea. But the victory was short-lived. Carver, publicly humiliated and exposed, was now a cornered animal. That afternoon, he sent for a man named Wes Tobin, a drifter with cold eyes and a reputation for doing ugly jobs for pay. The standoff happened at dusk, at the river crossing a mile from the ranch. Luke had ridden out to check on the cattle he'd recovered, and he was on his way back. Tobin was waiting for him, half hidden in a stand of cottonwoods. McAllister," Tobin called out, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He sat easily on his horse, a long-barreled Colt resting on his thigh. Luke reined in Dust Devil, his hand hovering near his own pistol. "I do not know you." "Name's Tobin. I have a message for you from Mr. Carver. He thinks this valley is getting a little crowded. He suggests you and the woman pack up and ride out. He will even pay a fair price for your land, considering the trouble." "I am not for sale," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. Tobin sighed, a theatrical gesture. "I was afraid you would say that. That makes my job harder." The world seemed to fall silent. The only sounds were the gentle flow of the river and the whisper of the wind in the trees. Tobin's hand moved, a blur of motion. Luke was just as fast. 2 shots exploded in the twilight, almost as one. A white-hot poker of pain seared through Luke's left shoulder, knocking him back in the saddle. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the blackness that threatened to overwhelm him. He had managed to get his own shot off, hitting Tobin in the leg. The gunman cursed, his horse rearing in panic, and galloped away, retreating back toward town. Luke swayed, his vision blurring. He clutched his shoulder, his shirt already soaked with warm, sticky blood. He had to get back to the ranch, back to Sarah, with a monumental effort of will. He turned his horse and urged it into a slow, agonizing walk home. Sarah found him slumped over Dust Devil's neck in the yard, barely conscious. A cry of pure terror escaped her. She helped him down, his full weight leaning on her, and half dragged him into the cabin. The night was a fever dream of fear and desperate care. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat for bandages and washed the wound with whiskey, her hands shaking as he groaned in pain. The bullet had gone clean through, but he had lost a lot of blood, and a fever was beginning to set in. She sat by his cot all night, pressing cool, damp cloths to his forehead, whispering reassurances to him and to herself, sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn. His eyes fluttered open. They were lucid for the first time in hours. He looked at her, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Tears she had not realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. She took his hand, her touch infinitely gentle. "I am here, Luke, I am here." "You should have left me," he murmured, his eyes clouded with pain. "Should have run." "Do not say that," she choked out, leaning closer, her tears falling onto his hand. "Never say that." She pressed his hand to her cheek, the world shrinking to just the two of them in the flickering lamplight. "You are all I have left," she whispered, the words a raw, unguarded confession torn from the deepest part of her soul. He squeezed her hand weakly, his thumb brushing against her skin. A silent understanding passed between them, more profound than any promise. There was no future, no certainty, only the truth of this moment. Two broken people holding on to each other in the dark. Their quiet, unspoken love the only thing left to fight for. In the days that followed, as Sarah nursed him back from the edge, the tide began to turn in redemption. The story of the gunfight, of Carver hiring an outsider to settle his grudge, was a step too far for many. People began to talk, to connect the dots between Carver's ambitions and the misfortunes of his neighbors. His fraud, once a whispered rumor, was now discussed as fact. Carver, watching his power crumble, made one last, desperate move. If he could not have the land, no one would. He sent his most loyal men, the ones paid to do his dirty work, under the cover of darkness. Sarah was woken by a hellish, orange glow. She looked out the window and her blood ran cold. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry timber walls, reaching for the night sky, a monstrous echo of the fire that had destroyed her past. "Luke!" she screamed, shaking him awake. "The barn!" He struggled to sit up, his face pale, but his eyes were clear and hard. He grabbed his rifle. Sarah did not hesitate. She filled every bucket they owned with water from the well. They burst out of the cabin into a scene from a nightmare. The heat was a physical blow, and the roar of the fire was deafening. Luke, weak as he was, began firing his rifle into the darkness, driving off the shadows of the men who had set the blaze. Sarah ran back and forth from the well, throwing buckets of water onto the flames in a desperate, futile attempt to save it. The fire was too big, too hot. The roof groaned and then collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and embers. She stopped, panting, her face streaked with soot, her heart pounding. She looked at the inferno, at the red sky filled with smoke and ash. It was the same sky from the night her old life had ended. But this time was different. She was not alone. She was not helpless. She looked over at Luke, who had come to stand beside her, his wounded shoulder slumping, his face grim in the firelight. He looked at the burning wreck of his barn. Another piece of his life turned to ash. She reached out and took his hand, her small, soot-covered fingers lacing through his. He gripped her hand tightly, his anchor in the chaos. They stood there, side by side, watching their barn burn, the flames reflected in their eyes. This time, she refused to run. The dawn broke, gray and cheerless, on a scene of utter devastation. The first light revealed the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the barn, a gaping wound on the landscape. A haze of smoke and ash hung in the air, a bitter incense of hatred and loss. They stood there for a long time. Sarah and Luke, hand in hand amidst the ruin, their faces streaked with soot, their bodies aching with exhaustion. The fire had taken everything. Hay for the winter, tools, saddles, a place of shelter. But as Sarah looked from the smoldering timbers to the man standing beside her, his grip firm and steady in hers, she knew the fire had not taken what mattered most. The news of the arson, coming on the heels of the gunfight, was the final spark in the powder keg of redemption. The town's shame, which had been simmering beneath the surface, finally boiled over into outrage. Silas Carver had gone too far. He had moved beyond financial bullying and slander into open violence, bringing a hired gunman and fire to their valley. The attack was not just on Luke McAllister. It was an attack on the community itself, a violation of the unwritten codes of the frontier. This time, the crowd that gathered in the main street was not a mob Carver had bought, but a posse he had earned. Men who had once averted their eyes from Luke now spoke his name with a grim respect. Tom Pullman, the rancher who had led the first group to the ranch, was at the forefront, his face a mask of shame and determination. He, along with others ruined by Carver's schemes, went to the sheriff's office and made a statement. The truth, once exposed, was an unstoppable force. Faced with a warrant for his arrest and the fury of a town that had finally turned on him, Silas Carver fled. He slipped out of his fine house in the dead of night, a man suddenly stripped of his power and influence. Hunted not by the law he had so often bent to his will, but by the ghosts of the lives he had destroyed. He became a cautionary tale, a whisper in the saloons up and down the territory. Another greedy man swallowed by the vast, unforgiving land he had tried to conquer. His reign was over. Luke's land was safe. In the days that followed, a slow, tentative peace began to settle over the valley. The town's acceptance of Sarah came not in a grand apology, but in small, quiet gestures. One morning, Mr. Henderson from the Mercantile rode out in his wagon, his face etched with a quiet remorse. He brought lumber, nails, and a crate of supplies. On credit, he said, not quite meeting Luke's eye. Pay me back when you can. The blacksmith came next, offering his strong back to help clear the debris. Even the preacher's wife left a basket of fresh bread and preserves on the cabin porch, a silent offering of peace. The whispers did not fade entirely. Scars on a reputation, like scars on the skin, have a way of remaining. But their tone changed. The scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging admiration. Sarah was no longer the fallen woman. She was the woman who had stood up to Silas Carver, the woman who had stood by her man in the face of fire and bullets. She learned to accept their awkward kindness, understanding that it was as much for their own salvation as it was for hers. But as the external war ended, an internal one began. The violence and exertion had taken a terrible toll on Luke. His shoulder wound, which had begun to heal, grew inflamed. The fever returned with a vengeance, and a deep, consuming infection set in. The strength that had seemed as boundless as the prairie began to fade, leaving him weak and frail. He who had been her rock, her protector, was now completely dependent on her care. Winter arrived early, burying the valley in a deep blanket of snow. The world outside the cabin windows became a vast expanse of white, the silence broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. They were sealed off, isolated in a world of their own making. This long, cold season became Sarah's watch. She nursed him with a fierce, unwavering tenderness. When his fevered nightmares came, thrashing him back to the gunfight on the Red River, she would be there, her cool hand on his brow, her soft voice pulling him back from the brink. She learned to hunt, taking Luke's rifle and tracking rabbits in the snow, her success driven by a desperate need to provide for him. She chopped wood, her small frame wiry and strong from months of labor. She kept the fire roaring, a constant bastion against the encroaching cold, and sat by his side for endless hours, spooning broth between his lips, willing her own strength into his weakened body. In this crucible of ice and fever, their bond deepened into something elemental, beyond love, beyond need. It was a partnership of survival, a quiet, profound intertwining of two souls. He, in his vulnerability, finally let down the last of his walls, and she, in her strength, found the last remnants of her own broken spirit healed and made whole. Slowly, painfully, he began to recover. The fever broke, and the strength, though diminished, began to seep back into his limbs. He started to move about the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate, his left arm still mostly useless. He would watch her for long stretches of time as she worked, a look of quiet wonder in his eyes, as if seeing her for the very first time. During the long, dark evenings, they talked, they spoke of their pasts, not as fresh wounds, but as old scars whose stories could finally be told without pain. They spoke of the land, of the cattle, of the endless work that awaited them when the snows melted, and they began to speak of the future. "We should rebuild the barn," he said one night, staring into the flames. "Bigger, this time, stronger." With a stall for a new mare, Sarah added softly. He turned to her, his gaze searching. You would stay after all this? Where else would I go? She asked, a gentle smile touching her lips. This is my home. We could make it a real home, he said, the idea forming as he spoke. Not just for us, for others. Folks who get lost, who get chewed up and spit out by the world. Folks like us. He looked around the small, warm cabin, a sanctuary that had saved them both. We could build a place, a home for the lost. The thought settled between them, a seed of purpose planted in the fertile ground of their shared suffering. They would not just be ranchers, they would be keepers of a refuge, their own lives a testament to the possibility of finding a way back from the brink. Winter finally surrendered to a reluctant spring. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the first brave birds returned, their songs a promise of renewal. Luke was stronger now, his wound healed to a puckered scar, though a stiffness in his shoulder and a weariness in his bones remained, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid. One bright, clear morning, when the air was sweet with the smell of damp earth, Sarah took his hand. Come with me, she said. There is something I want to show you. She led him out of the cabin and across the yard to the place where the barn had stood. The site was a ruin of blackened timbers and gray ash, a monument to the violence they had endured. But there, pushing up through the scorched earth, was a miracle. A small, defiant patch of wildflowers had bloomed. Indian paintbrush, their tips a fiery red, and bluebonnets, the color of a twilight sky. They had taken root in the ashes of destruction, their vibrant colors a declaration of life's persistence. Luke stared at the flowers, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. It was hope, so pure and unexpected it was almost painful. He looked at Sarah, at her face, illuminated by the morning sun, her green eyes clear and full of a quiet, powerful joy. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle. You are not lost anymore, he said quietly. She leaned into his touch, her eyes shining. Only because you found me, she answered. In the final scene, a week later, they rode out together into the open plains. Luke was on Dust Devil, and Sarah rode a new horse, a steady bay gelding bought with the last of their money. The sun was warm on their backs, and a gentle breeze stirred the new green grass. They rode not with a destination in mind, but for the simple joy of moving forward, of being free. He reached across the space between their horses, and she took his hand, their fingers lacing together. They were two survivors, scarred but not broken, their future as wide and open as the plains before them. They had built a love not on pretty words or easy promises, but on the hard, unyielding bedrock of ruin and silence. As they rode toward the horizon, the wind picked up, carrying her voice to him, a whisper that was both a promise and a prayer. I'll follow you home forever. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.